So with that, I'm going to move to roundtable number 1, which is entitled Opportunities and Challenges in Food Loss and Food Waste Reduction. I'm going to moderate this session, and we have a number of panelists joining me, including Caitlin Dow from the Center for Science in the Public Interest, Nicole Flewell from Taylor Farms, Kathleen O'Donnell Cahill from Wegmans, Pete Pearson from the World Wildlife Fund, and Paige Sorensen from Cargill. So you can see we sort of have a good representation throughout the whole system. And what I want to do is really start out the panel with asking every one of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, your role in your organization, and maybe say a few words about how your organization is involved in and addresses food loss and food waste reduction. Caitlin, why don't I start with you for this?
Sure, thanks for having me. So my name is Caitlin Dow. I'm a senior nutrition scientist at the Center for Science in the Public Interest. And we are America's Food and Health Watchdog. We're a nonprofit group, a consumer advocacy group. And CSPI also publishes Nutrition Action, which is one of the largest nutrition newsletters. So my job is to write for Nutrition Action. So I've written about food loss and waste and date labels within that. So it's really the consumer education arm of CSPI. And then we also do advocacy work. So we work on restaurant foods, school foods, food safety, and food banks. So what we're working on right now is incorporating changes and advocacy for food loss and waste within each of those projects. So we are constantly looking for new avenues that we can get involved with improving both sustainability and food loss and waste in our existing projects and new projects. So I'm excited to be here today to discuss all of this and to also get ideas for how we can be supporting industry, legislation, and so forth to reduce food loss and waste.
Thank you, Caitlin. Let's next have Nicole Flewell from Taylor Farms introduce herself, and same questions as I asked for Caitlin.
Great, thank you so much for having me. My name is Nicole Flewell. I'm Director of Sustainability for Taylor Farms. Taylor Farms, for those who aren't familiar, we are a value-add fresh produce and fresh food supplier, probably the largest in North America to date. And so we're providing into the food service, retail, and deli sectors of the fresh food categories. And we do about 180 million servings a week of fresh food across North America. And so we've got a lot, we're a perishable product. And so there's a lot of potential for food waste and loss in our system, unfortunately. And it's a very fast paced and dynamic environment. And, we're talking about hours, making a huge difference in, whether food is viable to go out to consumers or not, really. And so, we do a ton to mitigate, food loss. And, it starts at the field level, ensuring that we're, forecasting and planting correctly, ensuring that we're, managing wet dates and harvest dates, field yields. There's so many, I could kind of go on and on about this, and I'll wait until the group gets started a little bit, but looking at everything from food, from the field level to the processing level, implementing programs in our processing facilities, such as the True Zero Waste programs. We really take an upstream look at food loss in our processing facilities and how to best manage that. And then all the way down to the consumer level, in partnership with our retail partners, through education, increased consumption, inventory management, through vendor management portals, all types of things. So that's a very, very brief intro, and I hope, I'm sure we'll dive into more as the roundtable continues.
Great, thank you. Yeah, definitely figure there's a lot going on with fresh produce in this sector. Definitely major challenge and opportunity. Kathleen, you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Martin, and thanks for having me today. And I'm Kathleen O'Donnell, and I'm with the Food Safety and Quality Assurance Group at Wegmans Food Markets. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Wegmans, we're a family-owned and operated regional grocery chain. So we're in our 4th generation of Wegmans leadership, and we have 106 stores that are located in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic area. I'm with the Food Safety and Quality Assurance Group. We do have a sustainability group led by Jason Wadsworth and managed by Chris Foote, and they were not able to participate today, so I'm stepping in to help them out. But the function of sustainability and of food loss, food waste is really cross-functional at Wegmans. And so much so that it's one of our 2022 priorities for the company, and specifically looking at eliminating waste and reducing packaging, especially plastic packaging, and reducing our carbon footprint. We really rely on that food recovery hierarchy to kind of guide us in our decisions. But as we look at what we're doing, we really have deep roots in minimizing food waste, food loss. Really started back in 1979 when we partnered with FoodLink to come and pick up food that was wholesome and usable from our DCs that we weren't going to be able to sell in our stores. This is when we were a much smaller company. We had stores in just upstate New York, but worked closely with them, instituted in-store pickups. To that added in refrigerated and fresh foods. And then we actually have it as part of our new store process that before a store even opens, we partner with those food banks, with those kitchens in each of those areas to make sure that we can best utilize any product that we're not going to be able to sell in the stores. Like I said, we have some individuals who are dedicated to sustainability. They were actually founding members of the Food Waste Recovery Alliance, kind of an alliance of food groups looking to reduce food waste at retail and restaurants. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Martin, and we'll continue on in a bit.
Great, thank you. Paige, you want to talk a little bit about Cargill?
Absolutely, thanks, Martin. Hi, everyone, Paige Sorensen. I'm a technical sustainability analyst within Cargill Protein North America's sustainability team. For those of you who might not be familiar with Cargill, we're a global food and agricultural company. We've been in business for 155 years, working across 70 countries. And we have many different supply chains that we work within. Like I said, I'm just protein, but so I've been with Cargill for just over a year and a half now, working on our signature sustainability program known as Beef Up Sustainability, which aims to reduce Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions of the beef supply chain specifically by 30% by 2030. So this program mainly accomplishes climate reductions through customer and NGO partnerships that launch grazing, soil health, innovation, and food waste reduction projects across North America. So within the Beef Up program specifically, I am leading the food waste pillar of that program. So much of my perspective on this panel will kind of come from that protein side of things. And I just want to highlight a couple quick things that we're working on within Cargill in the food waste reduction space. So pretty broadly, Cargill's tackling food waste through research and development and innovation, specifically in packaging, process efficiency within our operations. So this can be kind of seen through innovations on our teams that are working to develop shelf life extension packaging to enable food to stay fresher longer, and ultimately trying to reduce the amount of food that's wasted once it reaches the shelves and consumers. We're also trying to keep an eye on emerging technologies and startups. There's a lot of really exciting things that are happening in the food loss and waste reduction space. A lot of different people of different scales are working on these types of solutions. So we're keeping an eye on those technologies that might turn food into energy, food into alternative packaging, or create new pathways for keeping food in the value chain to prevent it from being wasted altogether. Finally, the last thing I want to highlight before we dive in is that Cargill Protein has committed to 10 by 20 by 30s, 50% food waste reduction commitment by 2030. So this focuses on the area of operational food waste, and we're actively tracking the protein waste across all of our North American facilities and finding areas for reduction and keeping food within that either animal feed or human edible supply chains as well. I'll pass it back to you, Martin.
Great, thank you. So for the overall audience, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat and I'll sort of feed them to the panel as we move along. Pete from the World Wildlife Fund would join us any minute, but I'm going to move a little bit into the beginning of the discussion, then circle back around to him. So first sort of what I'm going to call a real question is, what do you feel is the biggest challenge in achieving meaningful reduction in food waste and loss over the next 5-10 years? Where is your biggest problem? Where are your biggest pain points for you, either for your industry or general for the overall food system? Let's stick with the order for right now. Caitlin, if you want to start us out.
Sure, happy to kick this off, though. I would say that those of you working in industry probably have a better idea of the biggest issues that you're facing. From our perspective at CSPI, there's a few different issues that we see that we think could be most beneficial. So there's obviously big changes that are needed from the consumer standpoint, but we're also interested in how to get, this is often the issue with advocacy, is how to get people to care about food loss and waste. And so what we're interested in looking at, and I'm interested in opinions from others, is where can we make the biggest impact? We know with our audience that connecting food loss and waste to sustainability and climate change specifically is a big challenge that we are really focused on supporting right now. And so how to get people to understand that food loss and waste and that waste reduction should be an integral part of all methane reduction plans. And when working with appropriate stakeholders, food loss and waste should be framed as a climate change issue, whereas potentially with working with industry, maybe it's more of an economic issue. And then with households, it can be both for an economic issue. So reducing food loss and waste saves households money. And for those of our audience who are really interested and focused on climate change, maybe framing it as a climate change issue moves the needle more. So like I said, we're working on legislation and we're also working, so lobbying efforts, and then also working with industry. So I'm interested to see what those of you in the food industry see as your biggest challenges, and hopefully how we can sort of piggyback and support those.
I love that, how do you get people to care more as a big challenge? So do you have any numbers or even rough estimates? I mean, what proportion of people consumer really cares about it? And what proportion sees it as a, climate change issue, sees food waste loss as a climate change issue versus more of a, affects my own pocket, but not really sort of a bigger sustainability challenge? Any numbers there?
We don't have numbers right now. I would imagine that, a great resource that I've worked with is the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins. Ronnie Neff is a great researcher there, and I've worked with her a bit on consumer views on food loss and waste. I don't know that they've looked specifically on what gets people excited about food loss and waste. What we know right now is that it's generally a pocketbook issue for consumers, and that makes a lot of sense. And so something that I think we need a bit more research on is how to get people engaged in this. And so, yeah, I would imagine that both Rockefeller and Center for a Livable Future are looking into that kind of thing.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Let me circle back to Pete from the World Wildlife Fund. Pete, welcome. If you want to briefly describe to us your role in your organization and how your organization is involved in and addresses food loss and food waste reduction.
Yeah, happy to. So World Wildlife Fund started this journey about 6 years ago. I started the program, and the basic premise for the program is that when you look at the number one threat, the number one driver of habitat and biodiversity loss, it's the food system. It's agriculture. It's what we do in terms of farming. And then, so what I lead is our program on food loss and waste, which is addressing essentially the efficiency of the food system from farm to fork. Since that time, we've looked at it from specific pillars, one of the major ones being like commercial food businesses, working with the hospitality industry, restaurants, grocery stores all over the world. The second one is looking from an education standpoint. So we have a particular program called the Food Waste Warrior Program, which is focused on education and providing this work in schools. And then we've done a complete series around food loss and food waste that's happening on farm, that in the US, we've called this our No Food Left Behind series. And then last year, WWF UK published a report called Driven to Waste, which did another global analysis of food loss and food waste across the supply chain, but primarily focused on farm loss. And they found when you get better at estimation and you get better at measurement, the number that we've been talking about of a third of food globally produced is lost or wasted, we think it could be closer to 40% based on that Driven to Waste report. So, I mean, we've been working on this from farm to fork. World Wildlife Fund has a whole variety of private sector engagement, partnerships with some of the biggest companies in the world on this. And, I would say, to follow up on some of the comments that were just made, what I'm finding is that what's really attracting people into this space is the idea that the waste stream itself, whether it's post-consumer food waste or surplus that's happening on the farm, when we are able to unlock value in that surplus, when a company is able to take that, upcycle it, and create a profitable value from that waste stream, what was formerly waste, that's what's unlocking the potential here. And I think a lot of this conversation should start with the idea about landfill diversion, like getting things out of a waste stream and into a value stream. I'm really hopeful because I think this year especially, there's a couple signs of companies and innovators that are bringing things to market that are basically saying that there's a lot of value in this and the planet needs it, right? We need more organic material. We need more upcycling. And, the beauty of food is that you can do that. You can find those upcycling potentials. It's not always there with other materials like plastics and things. They're a lot tougher to upcycle and recycle. But with food, there's such an opportunity for creating that value. And so, yeah, happy to talk more, take questions, be part of the discussion. Thanks.
So you mentioned one thing. So it's like what is the real sort of value for food loss and waste? And you said it might be closer to 40%. Do you have any ideas what the uncertainty around that is? Because I mentioned it, like there's the numbers that get thrown out, but when we say 40%, does that mean we are 95% sure it's between 39 and 41? Or are we 95% sure it's between 10 and 70%? That's a big difference, I think. And it's important because I totally agree with you. As we measure it, we really can drive improvements much better if we have more accurate assessment of what the value is. Any idea on that uncertainty?
I don't have like a particular statistical uncertainty figure, but what I will say is that I think the 30 to 40% range is pretty close. I think we're dealing with an issue that, I mean, typically when you look at it through either waste characterizations or through company audits, you're finding that 30 to 40% range is pretty typical of how much food waste is being wasted, or how much food is being wasted. So I think to a pretty high level of certainty, we're probably in the right space, in the right range.
So the second question we've just been working on around the panel is sort of, what is the biggest challenge in achieving meaningful reductions? I'm going to stick with you for a second. What do you think? What is the biggest challenge we have in terms of getting meaningful reductions?
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to be treating food as a different material in the waste stream. We've spent the first 6 years of our program just talking to companies and businesses and the public sector about prevention, right? Everybody wants prevent. But what I'm finding is that it is really difficult to even move towards prevention if you do not have a vision for how a circular system works and how you take recovery and how you move things into a circular system. When you don't treat it separately as a material stream, you're not going to get the measurement to even be able to focus on things like prevention, typically. And so I think it requires that circular thinking right off the bat before you can start to move towards prevention. I think that's an imperative for us. And where that gets really difficult is especially in developing countries, right? You have huge cities, huge urban areas, tens of millions of people, incredibly dense, and really zero public infrastructure, public investment that can go into creating a true circular economy. So what do you do with that? How do you approach that? I don't know. I think this is a big issue. You have to figure out ways to financially invest in these circular systems and do it in some of the poorest countries in the world in order to create that circular system that can then learn from itself, understand how much food waste is moving through the system, and then be working to prevent it. I think it's a really tough road to try to do all the prevention stuff first before you have that circular economy built. And so I at least this is how I'm starting to think about it more and more, is that circular economy build out is an imperative.
So just from my understanding, I think what I think he's saying is, hey, if we separate food waste out, we can weigh it, we can measure it, whatever measurement we use. And therefore we will know if less comes into our recycling and upcycling efforts. And that means we can measure that prevention is actually working and we have better targets. Is that part of it, or did I misunderstand that?
I think it is, yeah, it's part of it. The separation of it from the waste stream enables you to do some of that measurement. It also brings in issues like contaminants and making sure that it's contaminant free. It really forces you to look at what is in that waste stream, because the more contamination you have, the less valuable it is, right? And so if you're able to then keep the contamination out, then you're able to dissect and figure out what types of value you can derive from that waste stream. And it unlocks all kinds of innovative potential from entrepreneurs and people that want to get benefit from that want to profit from that. As soon as it's profitable, then we're off to the races. That's a great thing. What you're looking for is a dynamic where a company is giving this away for free and picking it up so that you can turn it into something useful. And I think we're at the cusp of that shift. I think that shift is happening right now.
Okay, thank you. So continuing on the theme of challenge, Nicole, biggest challenge from your vantage point, from your company's point.
Yeah, I think unfortunately there's a lot of challenges. One is a financial piece, from a supplier perspective, right? If we've got surplus product at the field level, to get that product, harvested, knowing that it's not going to go out for sale, getting that product harvested, into our, cooling supply chain, and then stored into our facilities for someone then to come pick it up, whether it's a food bank or one of these kind of innovators that Pete was kind of speaking to. We've had a lot of conversations with folks like this over the years, trying to, add value to that piece. All of that still has a significant financial impact, for us as an organization, that, we just have to take into consideration. Also, systems for tracking and measuring this, at the field level, it's really challenging. There's this CISC calculator that we've been, trying to investigate more and understand how that works to get an accurate measurement of, food loss and waste happening at the field level. But it's a cumbersome task to try and get that measurement in place. It involves walking the fields, counting head loss after, harvest, or, quality defects, or all of these different things. And so when you're talking about, 40,000 cropped acres, to having that secondary, walk process, we're already walking our fields, before planting goes in, part of pre-harvest, inspections and testing, part of, harvest process. And so adding another layer and component to that is just a cost from a financial and resource perspective. Technology, I think, is another barrier, and a cost, barrier for a lot of folks to be able to kind of come in and play at this level. Having that technology for forecasting or for automation, to help expedite and make these processes more efficient, I think is a huge barrier for folks. We're a huge company, $6 billion company, and we're still struggling to kind of get into this technology space and find the systems that exist to track and measure and manage this at an effective level. I think another big piece, kind of looking, taking a step back, is at a consumer level and the desire for perfection. I think this is especially true in the fresh food category, and we've had growth in the imperfect produce movement and things like that, but I don't know that it's taken off enough. And I think that there's some innovative ways that we could try and tackle this, again, in partnership with retail partners, and just a consumer education piece. But that consumer desire for that perfect piece of produce, that perfect fruit, if it's got a little bruise on it, they're going to pass it by and just move on to the next one that looks, more appealing. I think having some consumer education around that, could really help. Outlets for surplus food, we rely very heavily on food banks, but they have very limited capacity, at their facilities for items that require a cold food chain. So having better infrastructure there. Labor challenges, are another big problem. We see fields going fallow because there's not enough people to harvest product. And when you've already spent all of that time and cost and resources to get that product ready for harvest, and then you just don't even you just cannot find the labor to harvest it, that's a huge loss, a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity. So I think those are some of the main challenges in achieving reductions that I see. It's a systemic issue. I think Paige was talking earlier about trying to find outlets for alternatives to food banks, looking at waste to energy, with biogas and into product packaging, and we've taken a look at all of these solutions over the years, and I think there's a huge opportunity there, but it's not easy to dive into, and they haven't quite come to market in the way that we need them to. There's, we're based here in California, and we're working with a group that's trying to build a biogas plant, and just the permitting process alone, going through the state of California, for CEQA and everything else is just, it's incredibly lengthy process. They're going on 3 years trying to get permits on this. It's incredibly expensive. And so it just really deters people, I think, from even jumping into this space and trying to investigate what potential outlets are there.
Cool, thank you. Kathleen, biggest challenges for the next 5-10 years to make a difference here.
Yeah, some of the biggest challenges we face, and we really work diligently for zero food being put into our landfills. So all our stores have alternative waste streams. So whether the product goes to composting or whether it goes to an anaerobic digester, we have a few stores that separate some of the products out, and those might be donated for animal feed. But with that, there's labor associated with that. There's space associated with that. As we start going into different market areas, we are building smaller format stores, smaller back rooms. We won't necessarily have space to hold product. So we need to have services that are going to be able to get that on a daily or very frequent basis. I think we need to recognize that not all waste at retail is from products that are either damaged or dated. I mean, we have products we're doing processing in our stores. So we're generating from cut vegetables, so vegetable waste. We have melon rinds, we have pineapple peels, we have floral waste. So there's a lot there that needs to be disseminated to an area where it can be more useful or can be useful and not go into a landfill. We have to look at incremental improvements wherever we can as well. But we need to make it easy for consumers to be able to use their food waste and not just have it go to landfill. And to Pete's point, I mean, in our area, we don't have a residential food waste collection. And if people don't have an outlet for that food waste, they're going to put it with their refuse, and it's going to go to a landfill. So until we have some of those opportunities for consumers to be able to participate, it's going to be difficult. We collect plastic packaging and plastic bags in our stores, and customers bring those in for recycling. They don't have that same opportunity with food waste, and that's an area that we're going to have to start addressing as well.
Good point. Thanks, Kathleen. Paige.
Thanks, Martin. Before I jump in, I just want to call back to Caitlin's comment, and I think there's a question in the chat that relates directly to this about consumers connecting food waste with climate change and making that next step, or maybe there's a lack of education there. But I think that, you know, Cargill has done a lot of consumer insights research to try to determine, you know, consumers' education with various topics, or what are their greatest priorities or challenges or knowledge of environmental claims on product packaging. So we've done a wide breadth of research in this area. And what we're seeing is comparing, you know, research from 2021 to 2019, pre-COVID, to, you know, where we are at now, people are still claiming and thinking that climate change is the #1 issue to them personally when ranking, you know, out of 20 to 30 world and global issues. Food waste, the issue with that is food waste is not a part of that climate change. So we can't really flush out whether that makes up part of that decision. So that's definitely the next phase of that research that we need to do. But consumers are very much concerned with climate change, even more so than the spread of human diseases, as we've seen in our research in 2021. But the challenge specifically with this research and what we've been trying to do is COVID really disrupted consumer trends in the space of food waste. We saw a lot of panic buying in the initial COVID phase. So it's really hard for us to measure at the consumer level what that food waste is, at least from our perspective as a packer and processor. So that's something that we're trying to accomplish with some NGOs and other industry partners, is to take that research to the next phase to really try to understand the waste at that consumer level. So that definitely is a challenge that we're seeing right there. So I just wanted to call that out. But in terms of the biggest challenges that we are seeing, I would definitely echo what Pete said about circularity and, closed loop systems. We're definitely still far off from that. There is a lot of growth and momentum to take us in that direction. But in terms of, a national or global system or network, we're not really there yet, which is, like Pete said, preventing a lot of issues where a lot of work is happening in the prevention space, but in terms of dealing with waste when it occurs, there's not that circularity that is there on a large scale. But I think that people are tackling food waste, like I said, from so many different perspectives and entry points. So just really trying to connect people who have the problems with people that are bringing solutions is going to be really important for us, especially as some of these emergent technologies that I mentioned are trying to scale up and come to market, like Nicole mentioned, as being another challenge, is they're just not there yet and fully ready to launch at a large scale, like some large scale food companies might need them to launch at a large scale. So that's one thing. But in terms of that circularity, there's a lot of solutions, like I mentioned, that are coming. What we're seeing at Cargill is, the disruptions in the distribution of food can prevent it from getting into the hands of people who really need it, especially when that food is fresh. So, some disruptions might occur in the transportation or delivery of food where a customer might reject a food shipment because it's 10% later than the scheduled delivery, which the food is still in that optimal freshness, but a customer might not accept it. So one way we're trying to tackle that issue at Cargill is through those community focused partnerships, like I mentioned. But more specifically to that, one of that is known as a clean room that we launched as a pilot program in Houston a couple of years ago that diverts protein that can't be delivered to a customer to a food bank, where they have a specialty clean room that's designed to allow volunteers to repackage bulk protein that might be shipped in one of Cargill's large trucks, to repackage that into individual size packaging for people to have at those food banks. So thereby preventing, a large truckload of food that otherwise would have gone to landfill, to get it to people to that would be able to use it before it's being thrown out. So those are just some of the smaller scale solutions that we're trying to implement, and still keeping an eye on those consumer trends to try to tackle the issue of circularity that we're seeing.
Great, thank you. And good transition into sort of questions from the audience. So the one question Paige referred to was, how has COVID impact on consumer preferences influenced food industry loss waste reduction efforts? Anyone else want to sort of chime in on that impact of COVID on industry food waste loss reduction efforts and consumer behavior?
I can jump in on this one. I think things have more or less leveled out from a COVID impact, at least from our perspective. Obviously, there was a huge increase in retail purchasing, and so our packaged goods salad sector went up exponentially kind of overnight, and that wasn't something that we were obviously prepared for. Meanwhile, our food service sector tanked completely overnight, and they were seeing 80% loss. And the product that we grow for food service versus retail, to the untrained eye may seem very similar, but is very different. Our processing facilities are different, the infrastructure that's required, the packaging, everything that goes into it. So we were able to pivot very quickly. Our food service group came up with new innovative, pack ideas, and trying to get, food into consumers' hands. We partnered with the USDA, who was doing these special boxes for COVID as part of, community outreach. And so that was a great way for us to help kind of innovate. But, we had to walk away from a lot of acres of perfectly good edible food, and it was a really big challenge for us. Again, I think things have leveled out, more or less. Our retail sector is still higher than it was, pre-pandemic, but our food service piece has bounced back. And then the deli was another big piece. So the deli is a lot of your grab and go items, yogurt parfaits, quick, home, quick meals for, lunches, salad bowls, things of that. And when everyone stopped going to the office, that just became, an area of our business that was, not as much of a priority or a need for our consumers. And so, again, a big loss for us on that front. And so that was a big challenge.
Kathleen, anything on the retail side to add in terms of COVID impact on consumer preferences and how that influenced food waste loss reduction efforts?
Well, we certainly experienced the that panic purchasing and consumers stocking up, looking at foods differently, and really different purchase patterns. We had a far different assortment at our stores because we did things like we had to shut down our salad bars and some of our hot food options, everything going to prepackaged options. We're still seeing some of the effects of COVID on purchasing and on consumers, but as Nicole said, it's really leveled out quite a bit and getting much back to normal.
Anyone, any ideas with the COVID and change, people cooking more at home, if that's true? Does it reduce food waste? Does it increase it? I don't even, maybe I should know. I mean, do you expect per unit of food consumed, is the proportion of loss bigger for 100 meals at home versus 100 meals at a restaurant? Does that make a difference? Anyone, any thoughts on that?
That's a good question. I think it depends on, what people were buying. For us, we're a value add product, right? So we're packaged salads with, pre-portioned ingredients. And so we always talk about, yes, you are purchasing an individual packed item, right? But the amount of food, waste that you're contributing to decreases significantly because it is all pre-portioned, it's 100%, intended for consumption, whereas if you're going to go buy, the raw bulk ingredients, for, our chopped salads of some kind, there's your likelihood of food loss is going to be, significantly higher, to the point we all made earlier about, there's not access for consumers to have widespread access, at least for consumers to be able to, dispose of that material into, industrial composting facilities like we have access to at our processing facilities, that goes to either animal feed or to compost, or biogas, type of infrastructure. So I don't know the answer to your question, Martin, but, I think that it could kind of, it depends on how you look at it. It could go both ways. Quickly.
Kathleen, anything you want to add to this question?
So I agree with Nicole. What I haven't seen data on this, but just considering where food loss and waste comes from, once you get to the restaurant and consumer side of things, consumers waste a lot of food, but when people were cooking more at home and maybe didn't have the opportunity to be eating out, were they wasting less because they weren't going out to eat when they had food at home? So those are things that I don't know that we have answers to. And then also, a lot of food waste in restaurants comes from portion sizes that are too large, or from just, iceberg lettuce that's there to add a little bit of greenery to something. So there's that kind of waste that now wasn't getting wasted, at least at the restaurant, but then was it being wasted on the farm? So there's so many different input points there that, as we all know, makes this very challenging to figure out what the net effect is.
Okay, thank you. So another question was, are participants familiar with voluntary agreements to mitigate food loss and waste? And Gustavo added, I believe it is necessary joint efforts from distinct stakeholders from farm to fork. So anyone familiar with that? Does that work? Any success stories? Or
One thing that I mentioned in my introduction was that Cargill Protein is committed to 10 by 20 by 30's 50% food loss waste reduction by 2030. So that is a voluntary commitment that we've made. And that's really in terms of accountability to at our processing levels to track food waste more closely and to reach that 50% reduction. So in terms of, is it working? We're in the process of, comparing to our baseline. So we're still actively tracking that, and we won't know until the end of this calendar year to have a full comparison of our baseline. But just, I think the voluntary commitment and the accountability to make that change is the most important step to make first and foremost. And I think in a lot of cases, tracking food loss and waste is the best step in order to start combating that, because in many ways people might not know how much you are wasting. So that's really, really important. So that's just one example of a voluntary commitment.
We're also part of 10-20-30. And, to Paige's point, we've only just reported on our baseline. So, it will be, an ever-changing, ever-growing, evolving, participation in and, driver for, measuring and managing that food loss reduction. So I also mentioned we do the True Zero Waste certifications in our facilities, and diverting organics from landfill is our number one priority. In those efforts, we emphasize source separation at the point of generation, and so making sure that we're never cross-contaminating our materials intended for either recycling or for landfill, or for animal feed or product donation. That's one of the really integral pieces of that effort.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. We dealt with the 2 questions we got. So maybe sort of as a final question, if you can pick one group or organization and ask them to do one thing that would reduce food waste and loss, what would it be? Like, I'm sure Kathleen will say something. Ask New York to have mandatory food waste collection everywhere in the state, which I didn't think about, and that's stupid of me. But I think I could see how that could make a huge impact. And you can, and as it was mentioned, you can have good measurements and know how much of an issue is it in New York. You can compare it year by year. I think some of that could make a big difference. So, but that's something like that. Any thoughts?
And just to kind of tag on that, I was looking at this in Monroe County, about 80% of the greenhouse gases generated are generated by landfills in the county, and it's the methane produced from food waste in those landfills that's creating that. So it's a significant impact. But again, we need to have the infrastructure in place so that people can handle it, whether it's a consumer, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's a retail store. We're lucky we have a group that has been able to find composting and anaerobic digestion units that can handle that product coming from each of our stores. And we can divert it, and it's not going to landfill. But can we do more?
So, Caitlin, one thing to ask one group to do that'll make a difference.
I want to piggyback off of what Kathleen said. This is a real moonshot thing, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. But one of the biggest things that we could do is a federal organic waste ban. That would make a huge difference, and it would kind of ricochet up the supply chain, and influence a lot of, or I guess require a lot of creativity to figure out what to do with that organic waste, which would be great. And the more practical thing would be for Congress to pass the Food Date Label Act.
Thanks. Nicole.
I totally echo, mandatory collection of and building the infrastructure too. I think, just to add another piece is, if we could break down the barriers, for entry for a lot of those folks, and for a lot of innovators. There's a lot of kind of bureaucratic red tape that prevents a lot of people from entering in and being successful in this space. So regulation can be incredibly helpful in trying to drive change, but can also create a lot of challenges and create a lot of delays and financial burden that can stifle growth and innovation as well.
Great, thank you. Paige.
Pretty similar to what Caitlin mentioned, but I think within that same vein, a governmental enforcement of a kind of polluter pay principle, but with food waste would really prevent people from, or really, encourage people to not waste, in terms of, you could do that from the packing processor all the way up the value chain to the consumer. But if companies are responsible and accountable for dealing with their waste, people definitely don't like paying for things they don't need to, but you wouldn't really see, I believe, in my personal opinion, as much waste, and you would probably see more community donations or improved efficiency or closer management of supply and demand, and paying closer attention to that. But so that would be my recommendation.
Great, thank you, and thank you all for a very stimulating conversation here. Really enjoyed it. Really appreciate everyone's